Welcome to Easter week in Jerusalem, where you're on location, where the events happened that have impacted the world more than any other events anywhere and at any time. And the hope I have is to share with you, from the point of view of a Bible geographer, some of the scriptures and where they happened, and some brief meditations on those scriptures as we visit Jerusalem from our homes. Since we are restricted to our homes and our apartments, in Luke 21, we read, "During the day he was teaching in the temple, but at evening he would go out and spend the night on the Mount of Olives, and all the people would get up early in the morning to come to the temple and listen to him." And then a little further down in chapter 22, we read, "The chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put him to death because they were afraid of the people." And this is so important to remember, how the Jewish people loved Jesus, but those who were corrupt among their leaders hated him. Now, that's his daily routine that whole last week, our Easter week. And then he celebrates the Passover. Verse 7 of chapter 22 in Luke, "Then came the first day of the unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed." And we read about the preparations for the Passover meal and about the Passover meal. And this amazing thing that Jesus said, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Even though they're arguing about who's going to be greatest, he has these deeper concerns and his love in mind. And he takes that Passover ceremony of redemption from Egypt and generalizes it to redemption from sin as we partake in his body and blood, in his life. And then, after they had sung a hymn, now this is quite late at night by the time all of this is happening, he came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives. And when he arrived at the place, he said, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And in Mark, it actually tells us Gethsemane. And I'm standing by a Gethsemane, which has two parts to it. One is the huge stone that crushes the olives, pits and all, and then that's the crusher. And then the second stage is the presser, where you take that oily pulp and put it in collapsible baskets and apply tremendous pressure on the baskets until what comes out is the purest olive oil. You can hardly escape the symbolism of what happens to Jesus in the Mount of Olives as he prays and is in such an agony that it's like drops of blood falling down on the ground. And the disciples just over at the side sleeping. And then Judas comes. And Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and the elders who had come out against him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs against a robber? I was with you daily in the temple and you didn't lay hands on me." Well, why not? Because they were afraid of the people. "But this is your hour and the power of darkness." Then, after having arrested Jesus, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest, with Peter following at a distance. And Jesus had already predicted that Peter would deny him, and he does, 3 times. And then, chapter 22, verse 61, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. What will happen if the Lord looks at you and me? Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, before a cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Now that's what I pray for each one of us. Not like Judas, who knew he had done wrong and then condemned himself, went out and hanged himself. But like Peter, go and weep and let it go and see in that look both, yes, I caught you, but also I love you. And remember, Jesus had prayed that Peter would be restored. So this powerful event of Jesus looking at Peter. Jesus from Gethsemane was taken by the officers of the high priest to the high priest's house in the middle of the night. And they blindfolded him and asked him, prophesy, who hit you? And saying many other things against him, blaspheming him. And then there was a kind of midnight trial where Jesus was asked by the high priest, are you the Messiah? And Jesus said, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power. And so the high priest says, so you are the Son of God? And Jesus said, you just said it. And as it were, Jesus is the victim, but is he? Because he manipulates the conversation so that they say, are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? And Jesus said, you just said it. And then afterwards, they take him to Pilate. And here's Jesus, the victim. Or is he? Because the conversation goes in such a way that Pilate says, oh, so you are a king. And Jesus said, you just said it. But if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, but my kingdom is not of this world. Jesus had a more difficult kingdom in mind, persuasion of our hearts, not coercion. But where was Jesus that night? It just says they took him to the high priest's house, and then the next day. Well, archaeologists have discovered a prison below the high priest's house. And in that prison, there's a pit, kind of a chamber of solitary confinement, where you'd let the person down through a hole in the ceiling, and you could not get out without help. And it's just so powerful when we think of all Jesus is going through even before the crucifixion. It says in Isaiah 53, our griefs he bore, our sorrows he carried. We esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities, and the chastising for our well-being fell on him. By his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. 700 years before Jesus fulfilled this prophecy so dramatically. And down there in that pit, in the dungeon, there is a text with Psalm 88 in about 40 different languages, so that no matter where your pilgrim group comes from, you can read, and I'll read just a few verses from Psalm 88. O Lord, the God of my salvation, I have cried out by day and night. Let my prayer come before you. I am reckoned among those who go down to the pit. I have become a man without strength, forsaken among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom thou dost remember no more. They are cut off from thy hand. Thou hast put me in the lowest pit, in dark places, in the depths. Thou hast removed my acquaintances from me. Thou hast made me an object of loathing to them. I am shut up and cannot go out. And then I'm skipping. But, O Lord, I have cried out to thee for help. In the morning my prayer comes before thee. Why dost thou reject my soul? Why dost thou hide thy face from me? And then the end of that psalm, thou hast removed lover and friend far from me, and my only companion is darkness. So powerful words in the Psalms already, expressing what we can realize Jesus was going through in that pit in the high priest's house.
In the hands of the angels, in the shadow of the Almighty, He will shield me with His feathers under His wings. Under His wings, He will protect me.
After the resurrection, who were the first people to know that Jesus had risen? Well, we read in Luke that the women rested during the Sabbath and then went early, chapter 24 of Luke, on the first day of the week, early at dawn. They came to the tomb bringing the spices which they had prepared. But when they entered, they didn't find the body. And then there's the story of the angels. Why do you seek the living one among the dead? He's not here, he is risen. And they rush back to the 11 disciples, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women, telling these things to the apostles. But these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they didn't believe them. But Peter arose and ran to the tomb and saw the wrappings and went home marveling at what had happened. And then in the Gospel of John, it tells us that Mary has gone back just to be near the tomb where the body lays. And Jesus comes up to her. She thinks he's the gardener. And then when she says, Mary, she recognizes who it is. So she's the first one that personally sees Jesus after the resurrection, the one who loved him so much. She just wanted to be near the dead body. And then later that afternoon, there are two sad fellows walking on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus comes up and just butts right in and say, why are you looking so sad? And they start telling him about Jesus. And we usually don't think of Jesus as being an actor, but in this story, he played like he didn't know what had happened. And they tell him what's been going on in Jerusalem, and they get exasperated because he seems not to know. And they say, are you the only one in all of Jerusalem who doesn't know what things have been going on in Jerusalem? And Jesus says, what things? And that's them. Tell him what's been going on. And then he gives the second greatest Bible study in the world, where Jesus himself explains from Moses and the prophets that the Messiah had to suffer. And they invite him for the meal, and when he breaks the bread, they recognize him finally, and he disappears. Didn't our hearts burn within us as he opened to us the scriptures? So if that's the second greatest Bible lesson, what's the greatest Bible lesson? Also by Jesus, because they got so excited they didn't go to bed in the inn in Emmaus. They just turned right around, went back up to Jerusalem, found the 11 still awake, and then Jesus appears, and from Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, he explains that the Messiah had to suffer. And that's why I have the joy, being a Bible teacher, to proclaiming those as the two greatest Bible lessons ever, and just wishing and praying that all of us who are Bible teachers and preachers could do so under the power of the Spirit, so that hearts burn when we realize the truth of what the Scripture message is telling us of God, creator of the earth, taking all the responsibility on himself and redeeming us.